Sheepdog. So let's talk about situations after a violent act. So there's violence has come to our church or just into our lives. I mean, you're in the parking lot at the local Hy-Vee and something happens, or you're driving home and something happens, or you're at your church. One of the things that can end up being a surprise, I think, to us is that we might and are likely to be detained for a time. And people get really indignant because, and I think it's a natural thing, but it can also be a sense of entitlement, so we have to check ourselves, is in a situation when something like that's happened and law enforcement has arrived, they've got to secure the scene. They don't have a magic crystal ball, and I'm now able to include myself in that. We don't have a magic crystal ball, and I can tell you from some surprising things that I've been around where I have been arriving to the scene of something, and what gets called in and the way it's dispatched is completely different than the reality of what happened. And I know this is going to come as a shocker, but sometimes people lie. And so, be prepared for the fact that something has happened at your church. Someone has misunderstood it. Someone has deliberately and willfully lied when they called in to protect themselves, or they have some kind of an agenda. You may have people in your church who are anti-gun. You may have people in your church who are anti-safety team. And so you need to be prepared for that. You're on your way home, you're at the Kroger's, you're at your house, at work. Be prepared for the fact that people very likely will get it wrong. So I was there for a situation where an active shooter got called in, and it was called in as a shots fired active shooter. That's the way it was called in, and the dispatcher dispatched it accordingly. So they can only go off what they're being told. And so what had actually happened was somebody had been attacked in a parking lot and had actually drawn their concealed carry weapon and presented it, and the person fled. So there were no shots fired, and it looks like it was an attempted assault and or possibly a mugging. And the bad guy decided they didn't want holes in them. Strange how that works. And they ran away. I find a surprisingly small number of bad guys want to get shot. It's very strange. And so the way things get called in can have an enormous impact on how the response is from law enforcement. And so the other day I was responding to a call at a manufacturing facility that I had actually just gone off shift, and I was coming home, and I was talking to an officer who had his police radio because he was on duty, and he's like, "Are you hearing this? Because you just left your city and this is going down." And it was somebody had called in that there was somebody in the parking lot of the complex. They had a handgun and they were going to murder this person, and the messages were being sent through instant messaging is what we found out later. And so it was called in this way, and so we're being dispatched to an armed person on campus. At least the officers on duty were being dispatched to it. And I turned around and contacted the chief, and I said, "Man, I'm coming back, and I'm coming in hot." And I knew that one of the officers had been in town for a meeting, and I had heard through the phone over the radio that he was responding and he didn't have armor. So I had extra armor with me, and so I was scooting. And then he calls me right before I got there, and he said, "Hey, you can disregard. It's a hoax." We were able to isolate the situation and realize it was something like a swatting thing or something to where it really wasn't based in reality. Well, praise God, because that parking lot would have been a monster to try to chase a bad guy around in, and there's limited cover for the bad guy behind all kinds of vehicles. It could have been a disaster, and you're dealing with a complex that has hundreds of employees. Let's bring this over to church safety. So law enforcement gets called, and there's someone in your parking lot that has a weapon, and they've got to go through the parking lot and find them. And a lot of times when you're being dispatched as an officer to something, there's just a lot of things that you don't know. There's a lot of variables that you don't know. I mentioned in a previous video talking about responding to something, and we didn't know if it was a meth lab that blew up. There was that one of the things that got called in was that it potentially was a meth lab that was blown up, so there could be weapons present. We could have been dealing with from anything with people that are injured by shrapnel, the concussion of the blast, and or burns, all the way up to and including heading into a shootout with gang members. So that's a wide variety of things that you're potentially heading to. So please understand, when it comes to officers arriving on scene, they may even lack polish, so be ready for that. You may hear words that you have never heard inside of your church. I tend to not use them. I try as the chaplain and a believer not to swear. I'm not going to say I get that perfect every time, but I have yet to swear at a bad guy as a police officer, and I try to live that way. But when they come in, there's a very strong likelihood they are going to detain everybody in the immediate vicinity, even if it's just verbally saying, hey, nobody leave, we've got to get to the bottom of this. You are likely to get frisked. So if you're directly involved in something, and I think we know some of this at a pretty basic level, it's intellectually, but we need to be emotionally prepared for the fact that you've probably never been arrested. Odds are. You've probably never been frisked, and frisks get personal, let me tell you. I remember in the academy when we were doing frisking training, you get pretty personal. And so be prepared for the fact that you're holding somebody at gunpoint. It may not have been called in that way. There may have been a visitor at church that, you were completely on the side of the angels and you were doing exactly what you needed to do. And they may actually call it in from the parking lot and say that there's a man in the parking lot, he's got a gun, he's robbing somebody, and so you have a dispatched call of an armed robbery in progress in the church parking lot, and when in fact a guy emerged with a nail-studded baseball bat. I got to see one the other day in the line of duty where it had been taken from somebody that was a convicted felon and had a literal nail-studded baseball bat. And so you may end up in a situation like that where the officers are responding and you've been reported as the bad guy. So this is something to think about as a concealed carry permit holder. This is a thing to think about as a church security member. This is something to think about as somebody who's protecting their home. So, we're defenders, whether we're defending home and hearth or all the way up to our house of worship. And so be prepared for the fact that you may get called in the wrong way. Comply with all commands, and at the end of it, so let's say that the worst happens and that you end up in handcuffs. They're like, put the weapon down. You're like, absolutely, officer. I just want you to know I'm a member of the security team here at the church, in which having something on you, I'm a huge advocate of ID cards, where you have a picture ID card that is laminated and done up nicely, that is signed by your church's pastor, and that if you ever leave the team, they're handed in and surrendered, is that it shows if you're in handcuffs and they're getting ready to run your ID, and maybe, God forbid, maybe the pastor's not there that day, all the way up to including the pastor's not available for comment because they've been injured or they're no longer with us, they've died. You've got something in your wallet where you can say, officer, in my right front pocket is my wallet, it's where I carry mine. We got a minimalist wallet in there, and right behind my driver's license, between it and my concealed carry permit for this state, I have my church safety ID card. I am on the church safety team and I'm authorized to carry here. That can go a long way in a potentially volatile situation where there's a lot of moving pieces and parts, and you've got somebody that's swearing. That's probably literally swearing that no, this person attacked me. I just wanted to come to church, and I've never seen that gun before in my life, officer. This guy threw it at me and tried to shoot me. Whatever. It's one of the things that I've known it intellectually. I've seen it as a chaplain, but working in law enforcement, the number of people that will just boldface lie to your face in a situation like that is high, and it can actually be. There's a word I'm looking for. It can make you jaded. It can literally make you jaded in situations where you're like, man, I don't know who to believe. And so what you do is everybody gets handcuffs or gets at least detained until you can sort it out. I was in a situation the other day that there were 6 or 7, let's say probably closer to 8 juveniles and 3 adults, and there were threats that had been made. It was extremely volatile, and so I guarded one group, and the officer that I was with, that's senior to me, was taking them over and interviewing them one by one and getting the skinny. So I was able to separate and cull, but basically everybody at that point, there's 1 or 2 of them that kind of walked up on it. That nobody was really being, I'm sorry, the second group was not really being detained, but the folks that were in the primary group were. And you're trying to figure out what the answers are. And so be prepared to have a weapon pointed at you. Be prepared to see an officer come in hard armor, because if it gets called to them as an active shooting in progress, that's a big deal. And people will sometimes do dumb things, like they feel like, well, if I call it in as an active shooting, there's a guy with a gun, and if I call it in and say there's shots fired, I'll get a faster response. It's also a crime. If you lie to dispatch, it's one thing to not know and to be like, I don't know the circumstance. I'm home right now, and my wife just called in and said there's a guy on campus with a gun and church security surrounding him, and you call 911. Okay, you don't have all the details, but maybe what you can do is give the address. I've talked about that, those sorts of things. But be prepared in those circumstances to be detained and it not be gentle. If you've ever been in a situation where your adrenaline was surging, it might hurt, because they don't necessarily even mean to be rough, but the likelihood of somebody grabbing your thumb and bringing it around behind your back or whatever and cuffing you, and it may not feel comfortable, and they've got to get through a lot of people in a hurry, and you'd be surprised how many times bad guys will do something and ditch a weapon or hide a weapon and try to slip out of a crowd. They try to get out of that environment because they don't want to be arrested. And we were dealing with a guy that was about to get trespassed the other day, and as soon as he realized that law enforcement had arrived, I was watching him and from a distance, and he was staying where he was, and as soon as he realized that he was about to be trespassed or arrested, he tried to beat feet. And so the officer I was with, I called his attention to it, and he's senior, I was just there, mutual aid, and so it's his scene. And in that moment, we walked over to him and talked to the guy, and he lied, just an old-faced lie, go figure, that, nothing happened, and I never yelled at anybody, and I didn't do that, blah, blah. And so he was then trespassed and told, please don't ever return. If you do, you'll be arrested. But going back to that, be prepared for that response to look pretty scary, and people to come in, because depending on how it's dispatched, let's say that you've got somebody that's made threats, they pull the knife, you have them at gunpoint, they're down, the dispatcher may mess up, or the caller may mess up, and now you've got officers coming in, and be prepared for it to be in stages until they can tell them to disregard or to downgrade. Because when you're responding to something and you're being told there's a weapon present, it's going to change your response as an officer. When you're being told that there's a weapon drawn, it's going to change your response as an officer. And a lot of times, they'll come in with a long gun out, they're wearing heavy armor, that sort of thing, if they have it available, and they'll come in fast and hard, and may break the hydraulics on your door when they open it, and as they come in hard. So be prepared for that. Them to downgrade, and sometimes in bigger buildings, an officer may respond and they've got their radio, but their portable cannot get back out of your building. So it may take a little bit before, as the scene's being controlled and you're getting a stream of officers coming in, and I'm not being funny, you may see a dozen officers come in, weapons at the ready, and they're muzzling people. They're pointing their weapons at people because they're requiring not a target, not a target, not a target, not a target. Who's the bad guy? And it may take several officers on scene. They feel like they've got the scene controlled, and they go, hey, Paul, hey, Bill, go out there and get out on your portable, go get one of the cruisers and radio back and say, everybody can downgrade. Any units that are not already on scene can disregard. We've got the suspect in custody. So that's absolutely a thing. You need to be prepared for being detained. And being detained and being arrested are not the same thing. They're similar, except that when you're arrested, you're going to jail. And we also need to be prepared for the fact that if we are volatile in that minute, or we have a church member that's volatile in that moment, so let's say somebody has been harmed, and you've got a church member that comes up that is volatile, and we all can stop and probably go, oh yeah, I know who that would be at my church. I think we've all got one or two of those. If that's the case, and that person's going to egg it on or take it to an extreme, it might be best to as church safety, if we're still able to move around, to be like, hey, Bill, hang on, buddy. Law enforcement's got him, and they're going to go ahead and they're going to take him. They've got him in custody. The threat is over. Let's not make this worse. Because what can really happen in that moment? Is we can actually escalate a situation unnecessarily, and then we can find ourselves not just detained but arrested if we're refusing to cooperate. And I have seen people at scenes where they were a hair's breadth away from getting arrested because they kept egging it on. I literally had to tell the guys right before I went into law enforcement. I was still just the chaplain, and I would have detained him as law enforcement, and he would have sat in the back of my squad car. But I didn't have arrest rights, and so he was getting ready to go back into a situation that he'd been commanded to walk out of. So put yourself in this circumstance. You're at the periphery of a situation. You can see it, or you're just outside of it. They've asked somebody to step out. Maybe there's been a domestic violence situation in the church. Officers pointed at this person and told them to go outside. One of the best things you can do, if you have any rapport with them at all, is to try to keep them company. And this guy had come outside, and I was watching the perimeter because it was very volatile, and the officer had asked for my assistance. And so as more officers were pouring into the scene, this guy decided he was going back in after he had been told, if you come back in here, you're going to jail, because he had basically been refusing to leave. And so his blood was up, and he had something to prove, and he was trying to egg it on and get the other person arrested. My thoughts, but that's the way he was acting. And so I said, put my hand down, and I said, listen, I have no authority in your life, because I didn't. And he just kind of laughed. I said, but I highly recommend you not go back in there. And he's like, oh yeah, why is that? And I said, because if you do, you're going to be arrested. And he kind of sputtered for a second and turned around and went back the direction he was supposed to be, outside. In a situation like that, several times I've had to gently tell people, hey, listen, you have every right to be upset. You're acknowledging that, and you're affirming that. You have every right to be upset. But here's the thing: right now is not the time to go back in there. You've been told to stay out, and if you wait, they will call you when they're ready. They're going to figure the circumstances out. You'll have your opportunity to speak. You'll have your opportunity to be with this person. I dealt with a traffic stop yesterday where a lady appeared, and there were. She knew the girls that were being pulled over from her church, and what ended up happening was she was going to inject herself into that situation. And so as I was watching the car, and the officer was back writing a warning, I turned to her, and I could tell really quickly she wasn't a threat. And you really don't walk up on those scenes, but I was talking to her. And I was kind of hoping she would give a mom talk to the girls, because they had been doing some CNI driving, some unsafe driving. And so she did a little bit, but not much. And then as the officer over the radio, I heard he was going to emerge from the vehicle and come up and give them their warning. I said, you might step back over by your car if you still need to speak to the officer whose scene it is. Here in a minute, that's fine. And she's like, oh, okay, I'm good. And she walked back over her car and got in and sat down. And he gives the girls a warning: don't do it again. They clear the scene, or we clear the scene. Don't inject yourself into something that doesn't directly involve you. And also, because if they're trying to control the scene, it can actually make it much, much worse, if that makes sense. And I actually have a friend that there was a misunderstanding, and a guy was being arrested, and it was the wrong guy. It happens. And he came running up. He's like, hey, no, that's not the right. And he ends up in handcuffs, and on the ground in handcuffs. And because he's running at them yelling and in the dark, and they turn around, instead of him, at a distance, hey, officer, I might be able to help with this situation, and let them say, hey, come on over, what have you got? Or hang on just a second, I'll be with you in a moment. And so he actually ended up getting himself in handcuffs, and he was very upset about it. And it was before I was in law enforcement, but I was doing the chaplain thing, and I said, hey, you just have to understand, in these moments, they've got multiple moving pieces. It was a call to violence. They have the wrong guy, but he matched the description. You're right, they have the wrong guy, but it will get sorted out, and it will get sorted out pretty quickly. But by injecting yourself, and the way he did it, yelling and running up, he ended up in handcuffs too. And it didn't make the situation better. And so maybe you can do this for somebody that's in your church body that's maybe would go off half-cocked. You need to be ready for those circumstances. And I've talked about before, dealing with these circumstances, that you've got the emotionally disturbed person that goes off in church, but maybe their aunt is there or whatever. And I remember my friend James McGarvey talking about years ago how he was trying to help a woman, and or help a man who would collapse, and a woman grabbed him and was like shaking him violently, telling him to do something to help her husband. And he's like, I'm trying to, if you would stop hurting me, to paraphrase however he said it. That's a thing, and you may need to be there to be that whatever in that moment, and to say, hey, you're absolutely going to get your moment to say something, but it's not going to be just right now. So I hope that makes sense. I have conversations with people where they're like, well, this happened. Was I right in how I responded? Which that takes great humility. Was I right in how I responded? And if we're smart, we learn from circumstances. And to me, if we're smarter, we learn from other people's lessons. That's literally why I even started talking about church safety in the first place. Was so much of what I had to learn back in the day, I had to learn trial and error, and it was hard. It was really rough trying to learn all that stuff back in the day. And I learned a lot from other people's mistakes, whether they are in church safety or law enforcement or whatever. So may the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you. Remember Semper Disciplina, that lifestyle of discipline training. God bless.